I stood in the glass-walled conference room, watching Marcus Thompson tear apart my code review in front of the entire development team when he said the words that would haunt him forever. Listen up, everyone. This is what happens when we hire based on diversity quotas instead of actual talent. His eyes locked onto mine with that familiar smirk. Rodriguez here is completely replaceable. Any intern could do her job better. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. What Marcus didn't know was that Sarah Chen from HR was standing right behind him, holding a manila folder that would change everything. She cleared her throat and spoke 4 words that made my heart stop. Actually, she owns this company. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jazmin Rodriguez, and 6 months ago, I thought I was just another junior developer trying to survive in the toxic environment that Marcus Thompson had created at TechFlow Solutions. I'd been working at this Austin-based software company for 2 years, enduring his constant belittling, his dismissive comments about my work, and his barely concealed prejudice that he disguised as, quote, constructive feedback. Every morning I'd walk into that sleek office building on South Lamar, badge in, grab my usual coffee from the lobby cafe, and prepare myself for another day of psychological warfare disguised as professional development. TechFlow Solutions occupied 3 floors of a modern glass tower, all chrome and exposed brick, that screamed startup success. The company had been founded 15 years ago and had grown from a small web development shop into a major player in enterprise software solutions. The walls were covered with awards, patents, and those motivational posters that corporate America loves so much. Innovation, excellence, teamwork. Words that felt increasingly hollow as I watched Marcus systematically destroy the morale of anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of a real developer. I'd studied computer science at UT Austin, graduated summa cum laude, and had internships at 3 major tech companies before landing at TechFlow. My portfolio was solid, my references were glowing, and I genuinely loved writing code. There was something beautiful about taking a complex problem and breaking it down into elegant, efficient solutions. But Marcus had a way of making me question everything I thought I knew about my abilities. The morning everything changed started like any other. I arrived at 7:30, earlier than most of the team, because I'd learned that the quiet hours before Marcus arrived were the only time I could work without interruption. The development floor was still mostly empty, just the soft glow of monitors, and the distant sound of the cleaning crew finishing up on the floor below. I settled into my workstation, a corner desk that Marcus had assigned me, claiming it was perfect for someone at my level, though I suspected it was really because it was the farthest from the windows and the closest to the printer. I'd been working on a particularly challenging module for our flagship product, a customer relationship management system that handled millions of transactions daily. The code was intricate, requiring careful optimization to maintain performance while adding new features our biggest client had requested. I'd spent weeks perfecting the algorithm, running tests, debugging edge cases, and documenting everything meticulously. It was some of the best work I'd ever done, and I was genuinely proud of it. Tyler Brooks arrived around 8:15, setting down his messenger bag and giving me a sympathetic look. Tyler was one of the few developers who treated me like an actual colleague rather than an obstacle to overcome. He was a few years older than me, with the kind of laid-back confidence that came from knowing his worth in the industry. We'd bonded over late-night debugging sessions and shared frustrations about Marcus's management style. "Big presentation today," he said, pulling up a chair next to my desk. "You ready for the Marcus Thompson show?" I grimaced, saving my work and closing my laptop. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The quarterly review presentations were always brutal, but this one felt different. Marcus had been building up to something for weeks, making comments about performance standards and team optimization that had everyone on edge. The rumor mill suggested that layoffs were coming, and Marcus had been particularly hostile toward me lately. The conference room filled up gradually as 9 o'clock approached. Rebecca Walsh, our CEO, took her usual seat at the head of the table, her silver hair perfectly styled and her expression unreadable. Rebecca had built TechFlow from nothing, and she commanded respect throughout the Austin tech scene. She was tough but fair, at least from what I'd observed in company meetings. Marcus positioned himself next to a large monitor, his presentation already loaded and ready to go. "Good morning, everyone," Rebecca began. "As you know, we're in the final stages of negotiating a major acquisition deal that could transform TechFlow's market position. The due diligence process has been intensive, and every department is under scrutiny. Marcus has prepared a comprehensive review of our development team's performance and future staffing needs." Marcus smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Thank you, Rebecca. I've conducted a thorough analysis of our team's productivity, code quality, and overall contribution to company objectives." He clicked to his first slide, which showed a chart breaking down each developer's commits, bug reports, and project completions. My metrics were highlighted in red. "As we can see," Marcus continued, "there are clear performance disparities within the team. Some developers consistently exceed expectations, while others—" He let the pause hang in the air, his gaze settling on me. "Others seem to struggle with even basic responsibilities." I felt my face flush, but I kept my expression neutral. This was Marcus's favorite game. Public humiliation, disguised as data-driven analysis. He clicked to the next slide, which showed code review comments and revision requests. Again, my work was highlighted as problematic, though I noticed he'd conveniently omitted the context that explained why certain revisions had been necessary. For example, Marcus said, "The customer portal enhancement project that was supposed to be completed last month is still in review because of fundamental architectural flaws in the initial implementation." He looked directly at me. "When we're paying developer salaries, we expect developer-level output, not learning-on-the-job experimentation." Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I caught his eye and saw sympathy there, along with frustration. He knew as well as I did that the architectural flaws Marcus was referring to were actually improvements I'd suggested to make the system more scalable. Marcus had initially approved the changes, then changed his mind when the client requested additional features that would have been easier to implement with my original architecture. "Now," Marcus continued, advancing to a slide titled Team Optimization Recommendations, "I believe we need to make some difficult decisions to ensure our continued success. The acquisition process has highlighted areas where we can improve efficiency and reduce redundancy." Rebecca leaned forward slightly. "What kind of redundancy are you referring to, Marcus?" "Well," Marcus said, his smile becoming more pronounced, "we currently have several developers performing similar functions, but with vastly different levels of competency. I'm recommending we streamline the team by eliminating underperforming positions and reallocating those resources to proven contributors." The room was completely silent now. Everyone understood what Marcus was really saying. He was recommending layoffs, and based on his presentation, I was clearly the primary target. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind of detached clarity that comes when you finally understand that a situation is beyond your control. Marcus clicked to his final slide, which showed an organizational chart with several positions marked for elimination. My name was at the top of the list. These changes would improve our team's overall productivity by approximately 30% while reducing operational costs. The remaining developers would have opportunities for increased responsibility and compensation. "Specifically," Marcus said, turning to face me directly, "I'm recommending we terminate Jazmin Rodriguez's employment immediately. Her performance consistently falls below department standards, and frankly, she's completely replaceable. Any intern could do her job better, probably with fewer errors and complaints." The words hit like a physical blow, but what hurt more was the silence that followed. No one spoke up. No one challenged his assessment. Tyler looked uncomfortable, but he didn't say anything. Rebecca made notes on her tablet, her expression still unreadable. I realized that this wasn't just about my job anymore. This was about my entire identity. As a developer, as a professional, as someone worthy of respect in this industry. I was about to respond, to defend myself and my work, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. The conference room door opened and Sarah Chen from HR entered, carrying a manila folder and wearing an expression I'd never seen before. Sarah was usually calm and diplomatic, but today she looked almost angry. I'm sorry to interrupt, Sarah said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. But I need to address something immediately. She looked around the room, her gaze settling on Marcus. I couldn't help but overhear the discussion about Jazmin Rodriguez's employment status. Marcus straightened, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Sarah, this is a development team meeting. We can discuss HR concerns later. Actually, Sarah said, opening her folder, this can't wait. She pulled out a thick stack of papers and set them on the conference table. Rebecca, I think you need to see these documents. They concern the company's ownership structure, specifically some information that came to light during the acquisition due diligence process. Rebecca frowned, reaching for the papers. What kind of ownership information? As she began reading, her expression changed dramatically. The color drained from her face and she looked up at Sarah with something approaching shock. Are you certain about this? Rebecca asked quietly. Sarah nodded grimly. I've verified it through 3 different legal sources. The trust documentation is ironclad. She turned to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes that made my stomach flip. Jazmin, did you know that your father was David Rodriguez Miller? The question hit me like lightning. My father had died when I was 12, and my mother had always been vague about his business dealings. I knew he'd worked in tech, knew he'd been successful enough to leave us financially secure, but the details had always been fuzzy. My mother said it was too painful to discuss, and I'd eventually stopped asking. Yes, I said slowly. He died in a car accident when I was young. Why? Sarah's expression softened slightly. David Rodriguez Miller was one of the founding partners of TechFlow Solutions. He helped Rebecca start this company 15 years ago. She gestured to Rebecca, who was still staring at the papers in apparent disbelief. According to these trust documents, he maintained a 51% ownership stake that was supposed to transfer to his daughter upon her 25th birthday. The room spun around me. I gripped the edge of the conference table, trying to process what Sarah was saying. That's impossible. I would have known. Someone would have told me. The trust was managed by a law firm in Dallas, Sarah continued. They sent notification letters to your last known address, but it appears you'd moved for college, and the mail was never forwarded. When you didn't respond, they assumed you weren't interested in claiming the inheritance. The ownership stake has been sitting in legal limbo for 3 years. Rebecca finally found her voice. Sarah, are you telling me that Jazmin owns controlling interest in my company? Not your company anymore, Sarah said quietly. According to these documents, Jazmin Rodriguez owns 51% of TechFlow Solutions. She's been the majority owner since she turned 25. Marcus's face had gone through several shades of red and was now approaching purple. This is ridiculous. There has to be some mistake. She's just a junior developer. She can't possibly. Actually, Sarah interrupted, according to the employment records, Jazmin was hired under her full legal name, Jazmin Elizabeth Rodriguez Miller. The HR system flagged the connection during the acquisition background checks, which is how we discovered the trust documents. I stared at Sarah, my mind reeling. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my career, my place in this company was shifting beneath me like quicksand. But I applied for this job. I interviewed. I was hired as a regular employee. Because you didn't know, Sarah said gently. And honestly, neither did anyone else. Your father's legal name was David Rodriguez Miller, but he went by David Miller professionally. The connection wasn't obvious until we started digging into the corporate structure for the acquisition. Rebecca was reading through more of the documents, her expression growing more serious with each page. These papers show that David Miller retained majority control specifically to ensure the company would stay true to its founding principles. There are detailed provisions about employee treatment, ethical business practices, innovation over profit. She looked up at me with something approaching awe. Your father essentially built in safeguards to prevent exactly the kind of toxic management culture that… She glanced at Marcus, who was now visibly sweating. That some people try to create. The implications were starting to sink in, but I felt like I was watching everything happen to someone else. 3 minutes ago I was about to be fired as a replaceable failure. Now I was being told I owned the company. The whiplash was making me dizzy. Wait, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "If I own 51% of the company, then I have controlling interest. I can make decisions about hiring and firing." Sarah nodded. "Among other things, yes. You're essentially the primary shareholder with veto power over major corporate decisions." I looked around the conference room at the faces staring back at me. Tyler was grinning like he'd won the lottery. Rebecca looked stunned but calculating, already adapting to this new reality. The other developers were murmuring among themselves, pieces of office politics suddenly rearranging themselves in their minds. And Marcus looked like a man who had just realized he'd been building his house on someone else's land. All the power he'd wielded, all the fear he'd instilled, all the casual cruelty he'd dispensed, was suddenly revealed as nothing more than borrowed authority that could be revoked at any moment. "So," I said, my voice growing stronger as the reality settled in, "when you said I was replaceable," I stood up slowly, feeling like I was growing taller with each word. "You were talking about replacing the person who actually owns this company." Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since I'd known him, he was completely speechless. The conference room fell into absolute silence, as everyone processed what had just happened. In the span of 5 minutes, the entire power structure of TechFlow Solutions had been turned upside down. The junior developer who'd been marked for termination was actually the owner of the company. The manager who'd wielded his authority like a weapon had just discovered that his target outranked him in ways he'd never imagined. I thought about all the times Marcus had made me question my abilities, all the nights I'd gone home wondering if I was really cut out for this industry, all the small humiliations and casual dismissals that had chipped away at my confidence. Every Rodriguez here delivered with that particular tone of disdain. Every time he'd interrupted me in meetings or dismissed my suggestions without consideration. Every performance review where he'd moved the goalposts just far enough to keep me feeling inadequate. Now I understood why my mother had been so vague about my father's business dealings. The trust had been set up to protect me, to ensure I could make my own way in the world without the burden of inherited authority. My father had wanted me to prove myself on merit before I learned about my ownership stake. In a way, Marcus Thompson had been the perfect test of my character and resilience. I looked at the organizational chart still displayed on the conference room screen, my name highlighted in red at the top of the elimination list. The irony was almost beautiful in its completeness. The man who'd called me replaceable had just revealed himself to be utterly dependent on the goodwill of the person he'd been trying to replace. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Rebecca finally cleared her throat and began gathering the trust documents. "I think we need to adjourn this meeting and reconvene once everyone has had time to process this information," she said, her executive training kicking in even as her world had just been fundamentally altered. The other developers filed out quietly, casting glances between Marcus and me like spectators leaving a boxing match where the underdog had just delivered an unexpected knockout punch. Marcus remained frozen in his chair, staring at the organizational chart that still displayed my name in red as the first person to be eliminated. The irony was so complete it bordered on absurd. Tyler lingered near the door, shooting me a look that was equal parts amazement and concern before Sarah gestured for him to leave. Soon it was just the 4 of us in the glass-walled conference room: Rebecca, Sarah, Marcus, and me. "Jazmin," Rebecca said carefully, "I know this is overwhelming. Would you like to take some time to review these documents privately before we discuss next steps?" Her tone had shifted completely from the neutral professionalism she'd used throughout Marcus's presentation. Now she was speaking to me with the deference reserved for major stakeholders, and I could see her mentally recalculating every interaction we'd had over the past 2 years. I looked down at the stack of legal papers, thick enough to serve as a doorstop, filled with language I didn't understand and implications I was only beginning to grasp. "I think I need to understand what this actually means," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "What does owning 51% of TechFlow actually entail?" Sarah pulled out another folder, this one labeled with my full legal name in neat handwriting. "Your father was very specific about the structure of his ownership stake. He didn't just want to ensure you inherited financial assets. He wanted to guarantee you had the power to maintain the company culture he and Rebecca originally envisioned." She opened the folder and spread out several documents. "According to the trust provisions, Your ownership gives you final approval authority over all senior management positions, major strategic decisions, and any changes to the employee handbook or corporate policies. Your father essentially built in protection against exactly the kind of toxic management practices that— She glanced meaningfully at Marcus. That can develop over time. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. This has to be some kind of mistake. David Miller never mentioned having a daughter in any of the board meetings I attended. That's because you were never in board meetings with David Miller, Rebecca said sharply. David died 13 years ago, 2 years before you were even hired. You've been reporting to me, and I've been operating under the assumption that his ownership stake had reverted to the company when we couldn't locate his heir. I watched Marcus's face cycle through confusion, anger, and what looked like the beginning of panic. For 2 years, he'd treated me like an obstacle to be managed, a quota hire to be tolerated, a convenient target for his frustrations with company policies he disagreed with. Now he was learning that every dismissive comment, every public humiliation, every casual act of workplace cruelty had been directed at the person who technically owned his job. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said, pulling one of the documents closer and trying to decipher the legal language. My father set up this trust so that I would inherit controlling interest in TechFlow when I turned 25, but only if I was already working in the tech industry and demonstrating my own competence? Sarah nodded. The trust includes very specific provisions. You had to have completed a computer science degree, worked in the industry for at least 2 years, and be employed at a technology company when you claimed the inheritance. Your father wanted to ensure you understood the business from the ground up before you inherited the power to change it. The pieces were starting to fall into place, creating a picture that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. My father hadn't just left me money, he'd created an elaborate test to ensure I would be worthy of the responsibility that came with owning a major technology company. He'd wanted me to experience the industry as a regular employee, to understand the challenges and frustrations that shaped the daily lives of people like Tyler and the rest of the development team. But why didn't my mother tell me any of this? I asked. She had to have known about the trust. Rebecca and Sarah exchanged a meaningful look before Rebecca answered. Your mother contacted me about 6 months after David's death. She was concerned about the pressure and expectations that might come with you knowing about your inheritance. She asked that we not reach out to you until you were established in your own career. Sarah pulled out another document from the folder. There's actually a letter here from your mother to the trust administrators. She specifically requested that you be allowed to find your own path in the industry without the burden of knowing about your ownership stake. She felt it was important for you to prove yourself on your own merits before you learned about your father's legacy. I thought about my mother's careful questions over the years whenever I talked about work. How she'd always seemed particularly interested when I mentioned challenges with management or workplace dynamics. How she'd encouraged me to stick with jobs even when they became difficult, saying that learning to navigate difficult people was an important part of professional development. She hadn't been giving generic motherly advice. She'd been preparing me for exactly this moment. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, drawing my attention back to the immediate situation. So what happens now? He asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be favorable. I looked at him carefully, this man who had made my professional life miserable for 2 years, who had questioned my competence, dismissed my contributions, and just this morning had recommended my immediate termination. The power dynamic between us had shifted so completely that I felt like I was seeing him clearly for the first time. Without his authority to hide behind, Marcus looked smaller somehow, less intimidating, more like what he really was, a middle manager whose cruelty had been enabled by a system he thought would always protect him. That depends, I said slowly, on a lot of things. First, I need to understand exactly what's been happening in this company while I've been working here. Sarah, I want to see all the performance reviews Marcus has written about me, along with the supporting documentation he claims to have used. Sarah nodded and made a note. I can have those pulled from HR files within the hour. I also want to see the performance reviews and documentation for every other developer on the team for the same time period, I continued. And I want to review any complaints that have been filed against Marcus, either formally or informally. Marcus's face went white. Now wait just a minute. You can't just come in here and start investigating me based on some paperwork that might not even be legitimate. Rebecca's voice cut through his protest like a blade. Actually, Marcus, if these documents are authentic, and Sarah has verified them through multiple legal sources, then Jazmin has every right to review any aspect of company operations she chooses. You seem to be forgetting that she's not just an employee anymore. I felt a strange calm settling over me as I began to understand the full scope of what had just happened. For 2 years, I'd been operating from a position of powerlessness, trying to prove myself worthy of respect and fair treatment. I'd internalized Marcus's criticism, questioned my own abilities, and accepted his version of my professional worth. Now I was discovering that I'd never been powerless at all. I just hadn't known where my real authority came from. Sarah, I said, I want to schedule individual meetings with every member of the development team. Not performance reviews, just conversations about their experience working here, what challenges they're facing, what changes they think would improve the department. That's highly irregular, Marcus protested. You can't just undermine my authority by going around me to speak with my team members. I turned to look at him, directly, and for the first time in 2 years, I didn't feel intimidated by his presence. Marcus, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. I'm not going around you. I'm the majority owner of this company. There is no around me for you to worry about anymore. The truth of that statement seemed to hit him like a physical blow. I watched him struggle with the reality that everything he thought he knew about the power structure at TechFlow had just been revealed as an illusion. He'd been operating as if he were the final authority in the development department, but he'd never actually had that power. He'd been managing with borrowed authority that could be revoked at any time by the person he'd been systematically mistreating. Rebecca cleared her throat. Jazmin, while we sort through the legal implications of your ownership status, I think it would be appropriate for Marcus to take some administrative leave. This will give us time to conduct a thorough review of the department's operations and ensure we're moving forward in accordance with your father's vision for the company. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward into the wall behind him. This is ridiculous. You can't suspend me based on some random paperwork that conveniently appears just as I'm trying to improve department efficiency. This whole thing feels like a setup. Marcus, Sarah said quietly, the trust documents are dated 15 years ago. Jazmin was 12 years old when they were executed. Are you suggesting that a 12-year-old orchestrated an elaborate long-term conspiracy to eventually humiliate you in a conference room? The absurdity of his position seemed to register, and Marcus deflated slightly, but instead of backing down gracefully, he doubled down on his original stance. Look, I don't care who owns what percentage of the company. The fact remains that Jazmin Rodriguez has been an underperforming employee since the day she was hired. Her code is sloppy, her communication skills are poor, and she requires constant supervision. Ownership doesn't change professional competence. I felt something cold and sharp crystallize in my chest. Marcus wasn't just wrong about my abilities. He was actively rewriting history to protect his ego. Every project I'd completed successfully, every bug I'd fixed, every improvement I'd suggested that had been implemented into the final product, he was dismissing all of it to maintain his narrative about my inadequacy. You know what, Marcus? I said, standing up from my chair. Let's test that theory. Sarah, I want you to pull the actual performance metrics for every project I've worked on since I was hired. Not Marcus's summaries or interpretations, but the raw data. Bug reports, code review feedback, client satisfaction scores, project completion times, everything. I walked over to the conference room computer and opened my development environment, pulling up the customer portal enhancement project that Marcus had criticized in his presentation. This is the project Marcus claims I bungled due to architectural flaws. Let me show you what actually happened. I navigated through the code structure, highlighting the sections that Marcus had initially approved, then showing the modifications I'd made when the client requested additional features. The original architecture was perfectly sound for the requirements we were given. When the client decided they wanted real-time analytics integration and multi-tenant data segregation, I redesigned the entire backend to accommodate those new features without requiring a complete rebuild. Rebecca leaned forward, studying the code on the screen. She might have been the CEO, but she'd started as a developer herself, and I could see her following the logic of my implementation. "This is actually quite elegant," she said slowly. "The modular structure would make future enhancements much easier to implement." "That's exactly what I was trying to achieve," I said. But when I presented the revised architecture to Marcus, he said it was unnecessarily complex and demanded that I revert to the original design. When I explained that the original design wouldn't support the new client requirements, he told me to make it work anyway and stop making excuses. I pulled up the email chain between Marcus and myself, showing the progression of our disagreement over the project. Architecture. As you can see, I documented every decision and every conversation we had about this project. Marcus approved my recommendations in writing, then changed his mind when the timeline became tight, then blamed me for the delays caused by his own indecision. Marcus was staring at the screen with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That's not how I remember it," he said weakly. "That's the beauty of documentation," I replied. "Memory can be fallible, but emails and code commits are permanent." Sarah was taking notes furiously. "Jazmin, how many other projects have similar documentation?" "All of them," I said. I learned pretty quickly that Marcus had a tendency to misremember conversations that didn't go his way, so I started documenting everything. Every meeting, every decision, every change request. I have 2 years' worth of evidence showing exactly how this department has been managed. I could see the implications sinking in for everyone in the room. If I had been systematically documenting Marcus's behavior for 2 years, and if that documentation showed a pattern of mismanagement, then the problem wasn't with my performance. It was with his leadership. The developer he'd been calling incompetent had actually been building a case against him, one email and one code commit at a time. Tyler knocked on the conference room door, peering through the glass wall with an expression of barely contained curiosity. Rebecca gestured for him to enter, and he approached the table cautiously. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Tyler said, "but I overheard some of the conversation, and I thought you should know that I've been keeping my own documentation about department issues. I wasn't sure what to do with it, but if there's going to be an investigation, it might be relevant." Marcus's face went from white to gray. "Tyler, you're out of line. This conversation doesn't concern you." "Actually," I said, "it concerns everyone who works in this department." "Tyler, what kind of documentation have you been keeping?" Tyler pulled out his phone and opened a notes app. Email screenshots, meeting notes, records of project requirements that changed without explanation. "I've also been informally tracking how much time we spend on rework due to conflicting instructions and last-minute scope changes." He scrolled through his notes and I could see pages and pages of detailed entries. For example, last month Marcus told me to implement a new user authentication system, then 3 days later told me the client had never requested authentication, then 2 days after that sent me the original client email requesting authentication. I ended up doing the same work 3 times because of the confusion. Rebecca rubbed her temples. "How many other developers have been experiencing similar issues?" "All of us," Tyler said simply. "We've actually started sharing information informally to try to protect ourselves. Everyone keeps their own documentation now because the official project requirements change so frequently." I looked around the conference room at the faces staring back at me. Sarah looked like she was calculating the potential legal exposure the company faced if a pattern of mismanagement could be proven. Rebecca looked like she was realizing that the department she'd thought was struggling with performance issues was actually struggling with leadership issues. Tyler looked like someone who'd been waiting 2 years for permission to tell the truth about his work environment. And Marcus looked like a man who'd just realized that his entire management philosophy had been built on the assumption that his employees were powerless to challenge him. He'd created a hostile work environment, documented his own poor decisions in writing, and systematically undermined the person who unknowingly owned the company. The scope of his miscalculation was so complete, it was almost impressive. "I think," I said slowly, "that we need to have a much broader conversation about how this department has been operating and what changes need to be made going forward." The foundation of everything I thought I knew about my professional life had just crumbled, but underneath it, I was discovering something much stronger and more stable. My father had built safeguards into the company's structure. My mother had prepared me for this responsibility without my knowledge, and I had unknowingly been documenting the evidence needed to restore the ethical leadership my father had envisioned. Marcus Thompson had called me replaceable, but he'd been wrong about that in ways he was only beginning to understand. The question now was whether he would be the one who ended up being replaced. The next 3 days passed in a blur of revelations that fundamentally changed everything I thought I understood about TechFlow Solutions. Sarah had arranged for me to meet with David Hartwell, the attorney who had been managing my father's trust for the past 15 years. His office in downtown Austin was everything you'd expect from a firm that handled multi-million-dollar estates: mahogany furniture, floor-to-ceiling law books, and windows that offered a commanding view of the state capitol building. David was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and the sort of measured way of speaking that suggested he'd delivered life-changing news to people many times before. "Your father was one of my closest friends," he told me as we settled into leather chairs in his corner office. When he asked me to structure the trust this way, I thought he was being overly cautious. Now I see he was being remarkably prescient. He opened a file that was easily 3 inches thick, filled with documents spanning back to TechFlow's founding. "David Miller didn't just want to leave you a successful company, Jazmin. He wanted to ensure that success was built on the right foundation. He'd seen too many tech companies lose their soul as they grew, prioritizing profit over people, efficiency over ethics." The attorney pulled out a document I hadn't seen before, handwritten in my father's neat script. "This is a letter he wrote to you, to be delivered when you claimed your inheritance." He anticipated that you might have questions about why he structured things this way. My hands trembled slightly as I took the letter. The paper was cream-colored and heavy, the kind of stationery my father had always used for important correspondence. Seeing his handwriting again after 13 years brought back a flood of memories: homework sessions at the kitchen table, birthday cards with terrible dad jokes, grocery lists written in that same careful script. "My dearest Jazmin," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you've discovered that you're not just an employee at TechFlow Solutions, but its primary owner. I know this must come as a shock, and I imagine you have many questions about why I chose to structure your inheritance this way. By the time you read this, you will have experienced the technology industry from the ground up. You'll understand the pressure that developers face, the challenges of working in teams, the frustration of dealing with poor management, and the satisfaction of solving complex problems. Most importantly, you'll have learned who you are as a professional when no one expects anything special from you." I founded TechFlow with Rebecca because we believed technology should serve humanity, not the other way around. We wanted to build a company where innovation thrived because people felt valued, where diversity of thought was celebrated, where ethical considerations were as important as financial ones. But I've seen too many companies lose their way as they grow, forgetting the values that made them successful in the first place. Your inheritance comes with a responsibility, my dear daughter. You now have the power to shape not just a company, but an entire workplace culture. The decisions you make will affect hundreds of employees and their families. Use that power wisely, with compassion, and with the understanding that true leadership means serving those who depend on you for their livelihoods. I hope that by the time you read this, you've already encountered examples of both good and poor management. I hope you've experienced what it feels like to be undervalued, overlooked, or treated unfairly, because that experience will make you a better leader. You'll remember what it felt like to be powerless, and you'll use your power to ensure others never feel that way unnecessarily. Trust your instincts, listen to your team, and never forget that a company's greatest asset is not its technology or its intellectual property, but the people who choose to dedicate their talents to its mission. Build something that would make your old dad proud. All my love, now and always, Dad. I set the letter down carefully, my eyes blurring with tears I'd been holding back for 3 days. My father hadn't just left me a company. He'd created an elaborate lesson in leadership, empathy, and responsibility. Every humiliation I'd endured under Marcus's management, every time I'd felt powerless or undervalued, Every moment I'd questioned my worth as a professional had been preparing me for this moment. David Hartwell waited patiently while I composed myself. "Your father was very specific about the conditions of your inheritance," he said gently. "He wanted to ensure you understood the business from every angle before you inherited the authority to change it. Based on what Sarah Chen has told me about your experience at TechFlow, I'd say his strategy worked exactly as intended." I looked up from the letter, my father's words still echoing in my mind. "What exactly does my ownership position allow me to do?" Sarah mentioned I have authority over senior management decisions, but I need to understand the full scope. The attorney pulled out another document, this one thick with legal language and corporate bylaws. "Your 51% ownership gives you controlling interest in all major corporate decisions. You can hire and fire executive staff, approve or reject strategic initiatives, modify company policies, and essentially reshape the organization however you see fit. Rebecca Walsh remains CEO, but only at your discretion." He flipped through several pages, highlighting key sections. "Your father also built in some interesting provisions. Any changes to employee compensation, benefits, or working conditions require your explicit approval. The company cannot be sold or merged without your consent. And, perhaps most importantly, there's a clause that requires annual employee satisfaction surveys with results reported directly to you." The implications were staggering. Marcus Thompson had been operating under the illusion that he had final authority over his department, but in reality, every policy decision he'd made, every hire or firing he'd recommended, every aspect of the toxic culture he'd created, had been subject to oversight he'd never known existed. "Has anyone been monitoring these employee satisfaction surveys?" I asked. David's expression grew troubled. "That's where things get complicated. The surveys have been conducted annually, but the results have been reported to Rebecca Walsh as CEO, with copies supposedly sent to the trust administrators. However, it appears those copies were never forwarded to our office due to address changes in miscommunication." He pulled out a folder containing several years' worth of survey data. "Sarah Chen provided these yesterday." The results paint a very concerning picture of the development department under Marcus Thompson's leadership. I opened the folder and began reading through the survey responses. The data was damning. Employee satisfaction in the development department had declined steadily over the past 2 years, with specific complaints about management style, communication issues, and concerns about fairness in performance evaluations. Multiple respondents had mentioned feeling undervalued, micromanaged, and afraid to voice concerns. One comment in particular stood out. "The development manager creates an atmosphere of fear and favoritism. Certain employees are targeted for criticism, regardless of their actual performance, while others can do no wrong. Several talented developers have left the company because of the hostile work environment." Another response was even more direct. "Management in dev lacks basic leadership skills and seems to enjoy humiliating team members in public. The constant criticism and moving goalposts make it impossible to feel successful or valued. I'm actively looking for other opportunities." Reading through page after page of similar feedback, I realized that my experience with Marcus hadn't been unique or personal. He'd been systematically destroying morale across the entire development team, driving away talent and creating exactly the kind of toxic culture my father had tried to prevent. "This is unacceptable," I said, closing the folder. "How did this go on for 2 years without any intervention?" David sighed deeply. "Rebecca Walsh never received instructions on how to interpret these surveys in the context of your father's vision. She was managing the company to the best of her ability, but without understanding the full scope of the trust provisions, she didn't realize that certain management practices were violations of your father's explicit intentions." I spent the rest of the afternoon with David, going through every aspect of the trust structure and my new responsibilities as majority owner. By the time I left his office, I had a comprehensive understanding of just how much power I now wielded, and, more importantly, how my father had intended for that power to be used. The next morning, I arrived at TechFlow early, before most of the development team had arrived. I wanted time to process everything I'd learned and plan my next steps carefully. The revelation of my ownership had fundamentally changed the dynamic at the office. but I wasn't sure yet how I wanted to handle that change. Sarah Chen had prepared a comprehensive report on Marcus Thompson's management history, compiled from HR files, employee complaints, and performance data. The picture that emerged was of a manager who had consistently prioritized control over collaboration, intimidation over inspiration, and personal authority over team success. The report documented 14 separate complaints filed against Marcus over the past 2 years, ranging from inappropriate comments about employee capabilities to unfair performance evaluations to creating a hostile work environment. Most disturbing was a pattern of targeting employees from underrepresented backgrounds, including myself, with disproportionately harsh criticism and impossible standards. Tyler arrived around 8:30, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "I brought you coffee," he said, setting 1 cup on my desk. "I figured you might need the caffeine after everything that's happened." I accepted the coffee gratefully. "Tyler, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. How long have you and the other developers known that Marcus was treating me differently than the rest of the team?" Tyler sat down heavily in the chair next to my desk. "From pretty much your first week," he admitted. "At first, we thought maybe he was just being extra thorough because you were new. But it became obvious pretty quickly that he was holding you to completely different standards than everyone else." He pulled out his phone and opened his notes app again. "I started documenting things because it felt wrong, but I didn't know what to do with the information. Marcus has a lot of authority, and none of us wanted to risk our jobs by challenging him directly." I scrolled through Tyler's notes, seeing incident after incident where Marcus had treated me unfairly, criticized my work without justification, or assigned me tasks specifically designed to set me up for failure. But what struck me most was how detailed Tyler's documentation was. How carefully he'd recorded not just what happened, but the impact it had on team morale and productivity. "Why did you go to all this trouble?" I asked. "You could have just kept your head down and avoided getting involved." Tyler was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup. "My sister went through something similar at her last job," he said finally. "She's Latina, working in finance, and her manager made her life hell for 2 years before she finally quit. She never had the support or documentation she needed to challenge what was happening, so she just suffered in silence until she couldn't take it anymore." He looked up at me with a determined expression. I promised myself that if I ever saw something like that happening again, I'd find a way to help. I couldn't challenge Marcus directly without risking my own job, but I could at least make sure there was a record of what was really going on. The realization that Tyler had been quietly protecting me for 2 years, documenting Marcus's behavior and building a case I didn't even know existed, was almost overwhelming. I'd felt so isolated and unsupported, but in reality I'd had an ally watching out for me the entire time. "Tyler," I said carefully, "what would you think about becoming the new development manager?" He nearly choked on his coffee. "What?" "Jazmin, that's crazy. I mean, I appreciate the thought, but you can't just promote me because I kept some notes. Besides, don't you think the transition might be easier if you brought in someone from outside the company?" I pulled out the employee satisfaction surveys and handed them to Tyler. "Read through these and tell me what you think the development team needs most right now." Tyler spent the next 20 minutes reading through the survey responses, his expression growing more serious with each page. "This is worse than I thought," he said finally. "I knew Marcus was difficult, but I didn't realize how many people were actively considering leaving." He set the surveys down and looked at me directly. "The team needs stability and trust. They need to know that their work will be evaluated fairly, that their contributions will be recognized, and that they won't be subjected to arbitrary criticism or impossible standards. Most importantly, they need to believe that things are actually going to change." "Exactly," I said. "And who better to provide that stability than someone they already trust? Someone who's been working alongside them and understands their frustrations firsthand." I pulled out another document from my meeting with David Hartwell. "According to the trust provisions, I have the authority to restructure the management hierarchy however I see fit. But I don't want to make changes just because I can. I want to make changes that will actually improve the working environment and help the team succeed." Tyler studied the document, his eyes widening as he read through the scope of my new authority. You really do own this company, he said, shaking his head in amazement. I mean, I heard Sarah say it yesterday, but seeing it in writing makes it real. It's real, I confirmed. And that means I have a responsibility to use this authority wisely. Marcus Thompson created a toxic environment that drove away talent and destroyed morale. I want to build something better, but I can't do it alone. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Austin skyline that had become so familiar over the past 2 years. My father left me this company because he believed I could help it live up to its founding values. But I've only been here 2 years, and I've spent most of that time just trying to survive Marcus's management style. I need people around me who understand the team dynamics and can help me make smart decisions. Tyler joined me at the window, both of us watching the morning traffic flow along the streets below. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to help me rebuild this department from the ground up, I said. Not just as a manager, but as a partner in creating the kind of workplace where people actually want to come to work every day. Where talent is recognized and developed, where innovation is encouraged, where everyone feels valued regardless of their background or experience level. I turned to face him directly. I'm asking you to help me become the kind of leader my father hoped I could be. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what I was proposing. What happens to Marcus? He asked finally. It was a fair question, and one I'd been grappling with since learning about my ownership status. Marcus Thompson had made my professional life miserable, undermined my confidence, and created a hostile work environment that had driven multiple talented developers away from the company. By any reasonable standard, he deserved to be fired immediately. But my father's letter had emphasized the importance of using power with compassion, of remembering what it felt like to be powerless. Simply firing Marcus might be satisfying, but it wouldn't necessarily be the most constructive approach for the company or the team. That's still being determined, I said honestly. Marcus has clearly failed as a leader, and he can't continue in his current role. But how we handle his transition will set the tone for how the entire company views the changes we're making. I want to be firm but fair, decisive but not vindictive. Tyler nodded thoughtfully. The team will be watching to see how you handle this. If you're too lenient, they might think nothing will really change. If you're too harsh, they might worry about their own job security. Exactly, I said. Which is why I need advisors who understand the team dynamics and can help me navigate this transition carefully. The sound of voices in the hallway indicated that more of the development team was arriving for the day. Soon the office would be buzzing with the normal activity of a workday, but nothing about this day would be normal. Word had already spread throughout the company about yesterday's dramatic revelation, and everyone would be watching to see what changes would follow. Okay, Tyler said finally. If you really think I can help, then yes. I'll do whatever I can to support you and the team. I felt a surge of relief and gratitude. Building a new management structure would be challenging enough without having to do it completely alone. Having Tyler's partnership would provide continuity and credibility with the development team while I learned how to exercise my new authority effectively. There's one more thing, I said, pulling out my phone and opening the voice recording app. I want to document this entire transition process, just like we've been documenting everything else. If we're going to change the culture here, we need to be transparent about how we're doing it and why. Tyler grinned. Documentation as a tool for accountability instead of just protection. I like it. The morning was about to get very interesting. In a few hours, Marcus Thompson would arrive, expecting to continue his reign as development manager, unaware that his authority had already been revoked. The conversation that followed would determine not just his future, but the direction of the entire department, and my own evolution from powerless employee to responsible leader. My father had prepared me for this moment through years of careful planning and strategic patience. Now it was time to prove that his faith in me had been justified. Marcus Thompson arrived at the office at exactly 9:15, just as he had every morning for the past 2 years. I watched him through the glass wall of the conference room where Tyler and I had been preparing for what would undoubtedly be the most difficult conversation of my professional life. Marcus moved with his usual confident stride, coffee in one hand, briefcase in the other, completely unaware that the power structure he'd been exploiting for years had fundamentally shifted overnight. Sarah Chen intercepted him before he could reach his office, directing him toward the conference room where Rebecca, Tyler, and I were waiting. Through the glass, I could see the exact moment when Marcus realized this wasn't going to be a routine morning meeting. His step faltered slightly, his confident expression wavered, and his eyes darted between the faces watching him approach. "Good morning, Marcus," Rebecca said as he entered the room. Her tone was professionally neutral, but there was an undercurrent of steel that hadn't been there during his presentation yesterday. "Please have a seat. We need to discuss the restructuring of the development department." Marcus set his coffee down carefully and took the chair across from me, his movements suddenly cautious. "I assume this is about the ownership situation that was revealed yesterday," he said, attempting to maintain his usual authoritative tone. "I want to assure everyone that regardless of any changes in company structure, I remain committed to maintaining the high standards and efficiency that have made our department successful." The audacity of his statement was breathtaking. Even faced with the complete collapse of his authority, Marcus was still trying to frame himself as the source of the department's success, rather than the primary obstacle to it. I felt a familiar flash of anger, the same emotion I'd experienced countless times over the past 2 years, when Marcus had twisted reality to suit his narrative. But this time the anger was accompanied by something new: absolute clarity about my position and authority. I no longer had to accept Marcus's version of events, or pretend that his assessment of my performance had any validity. For the first time in our professional relationship, I held all the power, and Marcus was the one who needed to justify his position. "Marcus," I said, my voice steady and calm, "before we discuss any restructuring, I think we need to address some fundamental issues with how the development department has been managed over the past 2 years." I opened the folder containing the employee satisfaction surveys and placed them on the table where Marcus could see them. These are the annual employee satisfaction surveys that have been conducted company-wide. The results for the development department paint a very concerning picture of leadership effectiveness and workplace culture. Marcus glanced at the surveys, and I saw a flicker of something that might have been recognition cross his face. "Employee satisfaction surveys can be misleading," he said quickly. "Developers often have unrealistic expectations about management style and feedback. Sometimes maintaining standards requires making unpopular decisions." "Let me read you some specific feedback," I continued, opening to a page I'd marked earlier. "Management in development lacks basic leadership skills and seems to enjoy humiliating team members in public. The constant criticism and moving goalposts make it impossible to feel successful or valued." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "That sounds like it could be referring to anyone in the department. There's no way to verify that it's specifically about my management style." I turned to another page. "Here's another one. The development manager creates an atmosphere of fear and favoritism. Certain employees are targeted for criticism, regardless of their actual performance, while others can do no wrong. Several talented developers have left the company because of the hostile work environment." The color was beginning to drain from Marcus's face, but he continued to maintain his defensive posture. "Jazmin, I understand you're upset about yesterday's recommendation regarding your position, but using anonymous surveys to attack my management style is hardly professional." Tyler leaned forward, his expression serious. "Marcus, it's not just the surveys. I've been documenting incidents of problematic management behavior for the past 2 years. Would you like me to share some specific examples?" Marcus turned to Tyler with a look of betrayal. "Tyler, I'm surprised at you. I thought we had a good working relationship. I've always been supportive of your career development." "You've been supportive of my career development," Tyler agreed, "but I've watched you systematically undermine Jazmin and several other team members for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual performance." Tyler pulled out his phone and opened his documentation app. "For instance, last month you assigned Jazmin to rebuild the user authentication system, then criticized her for taking too long when she discovered that the existing system had fundamental security vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed before implementing the new features." Marcus's jaw tightened. The authentication system project had a specific deadline. Jazmin should have brought the security concerns to my attention immediately instead of taking it upon herself to expand the scope of the project. "She did bring it to your attention," Tyler said, scrolling through his notes. I have a record of the email she sent you outlining the security vulnerabilities, along with your response telling her to stop making excuses and complete the assigned work. I watched Marcus's expressions cycle through confusion, anger, and what looked like the beginning of panic as he realized that his version of events was being systematically contradicted by documented evidence. For 2 years, he'd been operating under the assumption that his authority was absolute, and his interpretations of events were unquestionable. Now he was discovering that multiple people had been quietly building a case against his leadership style. I want to be very clear about something, Marcus, I said, pulling out another document. This isn't about personal revenge or settling scores. This is about the fact that your management approach has been fundamentally inconsistent with the values and culture that this company was founded on. I slid a copy of my father's letter across the table. My father, David Rodriguez Miller, was one of the founding partners of TechFlow Solutions. When he structured my inheritance, he included very specific provisions about maintaining a workplace culture based on respect, collaboration, and ethical leadership. Marcus read through the letter, his expression growing more troubled with each paragraph. I see, he said quietly when he finished. And I suppose you feel that my management style violates these provisions? It's not about what I feel, I replied. It's about documented patterns of behavior that are inconsistent with company values. Sarah, would you please outline the specific concerns that have been raised about Marcus's management approach? Sarah opened her own folder and began reading from a prepared statement. Over the past 2 years, the HR department has received 14 formal and informal complaints regarding Marcus Thompson's management style. These complaints include creating a hostile work environment, unfair performance evaluations, inappropriate comments about employee capabilities, and targeted harassment of specific team members. She looked up from her notes. Additionally, the development department has experienced a 37% turnover rate during Marcus's tenure, significantly higher than the company average and higher than any other department. Marcus was staring at the table, his confident demeanor completely shattered. I had no idea that people were filing complaints. No one ever said anything to me directly. Actually, Sarah continued, several employees did attempt to address concerns with you directly before filing formal complaints. The HR records show that these attempts at direct communication were generally met with dismissive responses or retaliatory behavior. I studied Marcus's face, looking for signs of genuine understanding or remorse. What I saw instead was a man who seemed genuinely surprised that his actions had consequences, as if he'd never considered that his treatment of employees might be subject to scrutiny or accountability. Marcus, I said, I want to understand your perspective on this. When you recommended my termination yesterday, what did you believe that would accomplish for the department and the company? Marcus looked up, seeming to gather himself for one last attempt at justifying his position. I believed it would improve team efficiency and eliminate a source of ongoing performance issues. Your work has consistently required more supervision and revision than other team members, and I felt that your position could be filled by someone with stronger technical skills. The statement was so disconnected from reality that I felt a moment of genuine bewilderment. Marcus had convinced himself so completely of his own narrative that he appeared to genuinely believe I was an underperforming employee, despite mountains of evidence to the contrary. Let's examine that assessment, I said, pulling out a laptop and connecting it to the conference room display. Tyler, would you please pull up the actual performance metrics for all development team members over the past year? Tyler connected his laptop to the secondary display, and soon both screens showed detailed charts comparing code commits, bug reports, project completion times, and client satisfaction scores for every member of the development team. The data told a very different story than Marcus's assessment. As you can see, I said, pointing to the charts, my performance metrics are actually above the departmental average in every category except one, revision requests. And when we examine the revision requests more closely, we find that 73% of them were not corrections to errors, but rather changes to project requirements that occurred after initial implementation. I highlighted specific data points on the chart. My code has the lowest bug rate in the department, My projects are completed an average of 12% faster than estimated, and client satisfaction scores for projects I've worked on are consistently high. Marcus stared at the data, his face cycling through a range of emotions I couldn't quite interpret. "That's not how I remember it," he said weakly. "Memory can be unreliable," Tyler interjected. "That's why we keep detailed records of everything." Rebecca, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, finally spoke. "Marcus, I think it's clear that there's a significant disconnect between your perception of departmental performance and the actual data. More concerning is the pattern of employee complaints and the high turnover rate during your tenure as manager." She pulled out another document. "I've been reviewing the exit interviews for developers who left during the past 2 years. The consistent theme is dissatisfaction with management style and workplace culture. Several specifically mentioned feeling targeted or undervalued." Marcus was silent for a long moment, staring at the performance charts still displayed on the conference room screens. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was trying to maintain standards. I thought I was pushing people to be better." "There's a difference between challenging people to improve and creating a hostile work environment," I said. "Effective leadership inspires people to exceed their own expectations. What you've been doing is demoralizing talented professionals and driving them away from the company." I stood up and walked to the window, gathering my thoughts before continuing. "Marcus, I want you to understand that this conversation isn't happening because I have personal grievances against you. It's happening because your management approach has been harmful to the team, the company, and ultimately to yourself." I turned back to face him. "You've spent 2 years convincing yourself that you were surrounded by incompetent employees who needed constant correction and oversight. But the data shows that you've been managing a team of highly skilled professionals who were performing well despite the obstacles you were placing in their path." Marcus looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. The arrogance and dismissiveness were gone, replaced by something that might have been confusion or even genuine curiosity. "So what happens now?" he asked. "That depends on several factors," Rebecca answered. "The company needs to address the documented management failures and ensure that the development department can function effectively going forward. At the same time, we need to handle this transition in a way that's fair to everyone involved." Sarah pulled out another folder. "Marcus, we're prepared to offer you 2 options. The first is immediate termination with a standard severance package. The second is a voluntary resignation with the opportunity to participate in management training and leadership development programs, along with a positive reference for future employment opportunities." The choice was more generous than Marcus deserved, given the damage he'd caused to team morale and the company's reputation. But I could see the wisdom in Rebecca's approach. Firing Marcus vindictively would send a message to the rest of the company that the new ownership was focused on punishment rather than improvement. Marcus sat quietly for several minutes, processing his options. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression that was difficult to read. "Jazmin, I owe you an apology. I realize now that I've been unfair to you, and probably to others as well. I convinced myself that I was being a strong leader, but I can see that I was actually being a bully." The apology was unexpected, and I felt a complex mix of emotions in response. Part of me wanted to reject his words as too little, too late, but another part of me recognized that admitting fault required a kind of courage, especially in such a public setting. "I appreciate the apology, Marcus," I said carefully, "but what matters now is what you do with this understanding going forward." Marcus nodded slowly. "I'd like to take the second option, the resignation with training. I clearly have a lot to learn about effective leadership, and maybe this experience can help me become a better manager in the future." "That's a mature decision," Rebecca said. "Sarah will work with you to coordinate the transition timeline and connect you with appropriate professional development resources." As Marcus gathered his things and prepared to leave the conference room, he paused at the door and turned back to me. "For what it's worth, you're going to be an excellent leader. You've handled this entire situation with more grace and professionalism than I showed in 2 years of managing this department." After Marcus left, the conference room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. The confrontation I'd been dreading for days was over, and it had ended more constructively than I'd dared to hope. Marcus would be leaving the company, but he would have the opportunity to learn from his mistakes and potentially become a better leader elsewhere. "Well," Tyler said finally, "that went better than expected." Rebecca smiled for the first time in days. "Jazmin, I have to say, you handled that conversation beautifully. You were firm but fair, decisive but not vindictive. Your father would be very proud." I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. For 2 years, I'd been questioning my own competence and worth as a professional. Marcus's constant criticism had made me doubt my abilities, my judgment, and my place in the industry. Now, seeing the data that proved my performance had been above average all along, I could finally separate his toxic management style from any reflection of my actual capabilities. "Thank you," I said. "But this is just the beginning." Removing Marcus solves the immediate problem, but we still need to rebuild the department culture and restore trust among the team members. Sarah had been taking notes throughout the entire conversation. "Speaking of the team, how do you want to handle the transition announcement? Word has already spread throughout the company about the ownership revelation, and people are going to have questions about what changes are coming." I looked at Tyler, who would soon be stepping into the management role. "I think we should be completely transparent. Call an all-hands meeting for the development team this afternoon. Explain what happened, outline the changes we're making, and give everyone an opportunity to ask questions." Tyler nodded. "Transparency builds trust, and this team needs to see that the new leadership is going to operate differently than the old leadership." Rebecca stood up, gathering her papers. "I'll draft a company-wide announcement about the leadership transition and the management changes. It's important that the rest of the organization understands that these changes are being made to improve our workplace culture, not as part of any broader restructuring." As the meeting concluded and everyone began to disperse, I remained in the conference room for a few minutes, processing everything that had just happened. In the span of 3 days, I had gone from a junior developer facing termination to the majority owner of a technology company. I had confronted the manager who had made my professional life miserable and handled the situation with a maturity I didn't know I possessed. But perhaps most importantly, I had begun to understand what my father had meant when he wrote about the responsibility that comes with power. Marcus Thompson had been a cautionary example of what happens when authority is wielded without wisdom, compassion, or accountability. He had used his position to diminish others rather than develop them, to create fear rather than inspire excellence. My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. "Saw the news about TechFlow in the Business Journal. Call me when you have a chance. I'm proud of you." The Business Journal. I hadn't even considered that the story might be picked up by local media. The dramatic revelation of hidden ownership, combined with immediate management changes, was probably exactly the kind of corporate intrigue that business reporters loved to cover. I pulled up the Austin Business Journal website on my phone and found the article, "Tech Heiress Discovers She Owns Company Where She Worked as Junior Developer." The headline was sensational, but the article itself was surprisingly balanced, focusing on the unusual inheritance structure and the immediate management changes, rather than treating it as a simple revenge story. The article quoted Rebecca Walsh praising the transition process and emphasizing TechFlow's commitment to ethical leadership and employee development. There was also a brief statement from David Hartwell explaining the trust structure and my father's vision for the company. Reading about my own story in the business press felt surreal, but it also helped me understand how significant this moment was beyond my personal experience. The way I handled this transition would be watched by other business leaders, other employees who had experienced similar workplace challenges, and other companies dealing with management and culture issues. Tyler appeared in the doorway of the conference room. "Ready for the real work to begin?" he asked with a grin. I smiled back, feeling more confident than I had in years. "Let's build something amazing." The afternoon all-hands meeting with the development team would be my first opportunity to address my colleagues not as a fellow employee, but as the owner of the company. It would be my chance to explain the changes we were making, and to begin building the kind of workplace culture my father had envisioned when he founded TechFlow Solutions. The hardest part was over. Marcus Thompson was gone, the truth about the company's ownership was out, and the team was ready for new leadership. Now came the real challenge, proving that I could use my newfound authority to create something better than what had come before. 6 months later, I stood in the same glass-walled conference room where Marcus Thompson had once called me replaceable. But everything else had transformed beyond recognition. The development team had grown from 8 demoralized professionals to 15 enthusiastic innovators. Our employee satisfaction scores had jumped from the bottom quartile to the top 10% company-wide. Most importantly, we'd shipped 3 major product releases that had exceeded client expectations and generated record revenue for TechFlow Solutions. Tyler had exceeded every expectation as the new development manager, bringing a collaborative leadership style that encouraged innovation while maintaining accountability. The toxic atmosphere that had once permeated the department had been replaced by genuine excitement about coming to work each day. Developers were staying late not because they were afraid of criticism, but because they were genuinely passionate about the projects they were building. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Rebuilding trust after years of toxic management required patience, consistency, and constant communication. Some team members had been initially skeptical that real change was possible, having been disappointed by previous promises of improvement that never materialized. Others had been concerned that my sudden elevation to ownership might create its own set of problems, but gradual progress had built momentum. When I instituted weekly one-on-one meetings with every team member, people began sharing ideas they'd been afraid to voice under Marcus's leadership. When we started recognizing exceptional work publicly and rewarding innovation financially, the quality of our output improved dramatically. When we implemented transparent project planning and eliminated arbitrary deadline changes, stress levels dropped and productivity soared. The ripple effects extended beyond just the development department. Rebecca had asked me to help review management practices throughout the entire company, leading to policy changes that improved workplace culture across all divisions. The annual employee satisfaction surveys that had revealed Marcus's failures now showed consistent improvement in every metric we tracked. More personally, I'd discovered that leadership suited me in ways I'd never anticipated. The same analytical skills that made me effective at debugging code translated perfectly to identifying and solving organizational problems. The empathy that had made Marcus's treatment so painful also made me sensitive to employee concerns and workplace dynamics. Most importantly, my experience of feeling powerless and undervalued had given me genuine appreciation for the responsibility that came with authority. My mother had been right when she'd insisted that I needed to find my own path before learning about my inheritance. The 2 years I'd spent as a regular employee, experiencing both good and poor management firsthand, had prepared me for leadership in ways that no amount of formal training could have achieved. I understood what it felt like to have your contributions dismissed, your potential overlooked, and your worth questioned by someone in authority. The business press had continued following our story, with several articles highlighting TechFlow as an example of successful culture transformation. Harvard Business Review had even reached out about writing a case study on inheritance structures designed to develop ethical leadership. While the attention was flattering, I was more proud of the practical changes we'd implemented and their impact on actual people's daily work experience. Last week, I'd received an unexpected email from Marcus Thompson. He'd completed a comprehensive leadership development program and had been hired as a project manager at a nonprofit organization focused on technology education. His message was brief but seemed genuine. "Thank you for handling my transition with more grace than I deserved. The leadership training opened my eyes to how much damage I was causing. I'm working hard to become the kind of manager I should have been from the beginning." Reading his email, I felt a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that he seemed to have learned from the experience and was working to improve. Sadness that so much unnecessary pain could have been avoided if he'd approached leadership with humility and empathy from the start. But his acknowledgement also validated the approach we'd taken, prioritizing growth and learning over punishment and revenge. The conference room where this transformation had begun now served as our weekly innovation showcase, where team members presented new ideas and creative solutions to technical challenges. The same space where Marcus had once humiliated me in front of colleagues had become a celebration of collaborative problem-solving and mutual respect. As I watched Tyler facilitate today's showcase, listening to developers excitedly explain their latest projects, I thought about my father's letter and his vision for what TechFlow could become. He'd wanted to build a company where technology served humanity, where diverse perspectives were valued, where ethical considerations guided business decisions. Looking around the room at faces that reflected genuine enthusiasm and professional satisfaction, I knew we were finally living up to that vision. The young developer presenting today reminded me of myself 2 years ago, brilliant, eager, and slightly intimidated by the corporate environment. But unlike my experience under Marcus's management, she was being encouraged to take risks, supported when she encountered obstacles, and celebrated when she achieved breakthroughs. She would never have to question her worth or wonder if her contributions mattered. That evening, I sat in my office reviewing the quarterly reports that would be presented to the board next week. Every metric told the same story: higher productivity, lower turnover, increased client satisfaction, and stronger financial performance. But the numbers that mattered most to me were the ones that measured human flourishing: employee engagement scores, professional development participation rates, and internal promotion percentages. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. Another developer just told me this is the best job they've ever had. Thought you'd want to know. I smiled, thinking about how dramatically my own relationship with work had changed. 2 years ago, I dreaded coming to the office, knowing I'd face another day of criticism and undermining. Now I look forward to each day, excited about the problems we'd solve and the innovations we'd create. The transformation from victim to leader hadn't been instant or easy, but it had been profoundly meaningful. Marcus Thompson had called me replaceable, never imagining that his own position was far more precarious than mine. He'd wielded authority like a weapon, unaware that true power comes from empowering others. My father had structured my inheritance to ensure I would understand both sides of the power dynamic before I inherited the responsibility to shape it. His strategy had worked better than he could have imagined. The experience of being undervalued had taught me to value others. The pain of being dismissed had motivated me to ensure no one else would feel that same dismissal. As I locked my office and headed home, I passed the wall of employee photos that Tyler had installed last month. Every face represented someone who now felt valued, respected, and empowered to do their best work. Each photo was a reminder that leadership wasn't about commanding respect through fear, but about earning it through service. Marcus Thompson had been wrong about many things, but his most fundamental error was believing that some people were replaceable while others were indispensable. The truth was simpler and more profound. Everyone had the potential to contribute meaningfully when given the right environment and support. The company my father had envisioned was finally becoming reality, built not through inherited privilege but through earned wisdom, collaborative leadership, and the understanding that true strength comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.